Welcome back everyone. Thanks for watching our last video. I know it's been a long time since we've managed to bring the next one out. A few reasons for that, mainly our car was being used for other development work. So we've got the car back now, we managed to get the rest of the data, and this is the video in which we're going to be looking at some more data to do with inlet temperatures. We're also going to be looking at data analysis with the flow bench, and then finally the car will be on a dyno to see the effect between the stock airbox and the Eventuri intake. Before we start, just thought we'd like to just address a couple of questions which came up a few times in the comments in the last video. To do that, Matt's going to help me out. So Matt, what was the first question?
Why do you think you can do a better job than the Toyota engineers?
So obviously Toyota OEM company have a huge budget, loads of engineers. Why do we think we can possibly do better than them? Three words for that: noise, vibration, and harshness. NVH. That's the criteria which OEM manufacturers use when designing their intake systems. So Toyota are much more concerned with those three factors rather than trying to make an airbox for the best performance they can possibly make. Noise, vibration, and harshness is very important for OEM manufacturers, and they use the airbox to attenuate the sound. So they'll use it to restrict sound, and in doing so, there will be restrictions with flow and therefore power. So they do care about power, obviously, but they'll make the airbox to achieve a certain NVH level, and then they'll increase where they need to the boost from the turbo, so they make the turbo work harder to achieve their desired figure, if you like. So we're not concerned with NVH. We are looking for maximum power, and with that obviously comes more sound, which we like. So that's the main reason which we think we can improve. We can improve by increasing the performance of the intake by making it more efficient, and therefore it will be louder. So that's the reason. What was the next question?
Are you going to make one in plastic?
No. Basically, the reason for that is to make something in plastic, tooling costs are incredibly high, and we don't think we're going to be selling thousands and thousands of these. So we're going to stick with our bread and butter, which is carbon, high quality carbon, pre-preg, autoclave production. Just plastic just does not justify the tooling costs.
I've been told intakes don't make power.
I'm leaving. I'm joking. So we will prove in this video, hopefully, by looking at temperatures, flow bench, and finally dyno tests, that we actually have made power. But you'll see when you stick around for the rest of this video. So in the last video, we showed you some of our thermocouple placement in the car. Since then, we did add more thermocouples. We put a thermocouple in the engine bay, we put one before the intercooler and one after the intercooler as well. And then we took the car out and did some extensive data logging. Okay, so we're back out in the Yaris for some temperature data logs, testing the temperature difference between the stock airbox and the intake system, see the effect it has on the intake temperatures. We've got thermocouples wired into the car. We've got a thermocouple before the intercooler, after the intercooler, in the intake pipe, and also in the engine bay. So we've got a few data points here that we can analyze later. Testing procedure is going to be, we've let the car heat soak. So currently there's a stock system in the car. We let the car heat soak so that the temperature stabilizes in the car. And now we're doing third gear pulls from 40 miles per hour all the way to the red line. So I think it was 89 miles per hour, if I remember. I'll double check in a minute. So here we're doing another pull now. Yeah, just around 89 miles per hour. Then let the car coast back down to 40 miles per hour without using the brake, and do it again. So we get consistent runs, and the data logs will show us what's happening at the end. You can also see the stock airbox, the flap opening as we're driving. So we'll check that in a second. So we're now to 40 miles per hour. Flaps closed, opened. So it's just around 4,500 RPM. And it stays open until we get back down to, let's have a look, 3,500 RPM. Okay, so that will have an interesting bearing on the temperature logs to see the effect of that flap on what happens. It's interesting because as the flap opens in the gearbox, not in the gearbox, in the engine, in the stock airbox, the temperature starts to rise in the thermocouple, which is situated in the intake tube, and with that rise, the air temperature also goes up after the intercooler. So we've got our set of data from the stock airbox. We've got some consistent results, a good repeatable pattern. We're now going to take the stock airbox out, put the intake system in, let it heat soak, and then we'll go out again. Right, so intake is in now, thermocouples are still in place. It's been heat soaked, so we're at the same levels we were at before with the stock airbox. So that will make sure the test is nice and fair and scientifically done on both sides. Now we're going to go back out and do the same procedure from 40 miles per hour, third gear, full throttle all the way to red line, and then let it coast back down to 40 miles per hour and get a few of those runs in, make it nice and consistent, and then we'll go and analyze the data. Okay, 40 miles per hour. Coast down to 40. Obviously we're still seeing the same spike before the intercooler, as the turbo's obviously getting hot and boosting the air. The interesting thing will be to see what happens after the intercooler and compare stock airbox versus the Eventuri intake. Okay, so we've finished our runs. We've done 6 sets of logs. Got some nice consistent runs there, decent repeatability on the patterns. We'll go back to base now, and then start to analyze all the data. So with the data collection done, it's now time to look at the data in detail. The first thing to do is to look at why we went with the Eventuri configuration in its final form. So we're going to compare different variations of the duct and the rear tube. So let's look at the duct first. We had 2 designs. One design only was sealed to the airbox or the filter housing and only drew air in from the front grille. The second design had a secondary feed, so it pulled air in from the front grille, but also had a second feed which drew air in from around the engine bay area where the stock airbox pulls air in with the secondary flap. There's a opening or an inlet in the front bumper, so we wanted to see if there was an advantage of using a secondary feed. Okay, so on my screen I've got the temperature results for the 2 variations. So on the left of my screen is the variation which has a single feed, so only drawing air in from the front grille, and on the right is the duct with the secondary feed as well. Just quickly show you, the red line is the temperature in degrees Celsius in the tube after the intake on both sides, and the blue line is the ambient temperature. Okay, so looking at the left graph, which is the sealed duct only with 1 feed, we've got so where it drops off here is where we're going full throttle. So right at the bottom here is at maximum RPM, full throttle, which is where we're going to analyze the results. So at the bottom of that is 4.2 degrees with an ambient of 3.5 degrees, 3.6 degrees. So it's around half a degree delta. I'll just show you another data point here. We've got 4.1 degrees at full RPM, full throttle, with an ambient of 3.5 degrees. So again, just over half a degree delta between ambient and the temperature inside that rear tube behind the filter housing, which is phenomenal. Now, looking at the graph on the right, same intake, but the duct has got a secondary feed, so it's pulling air in from around the engine bay area as well. The scales are slightly different on the y-axis, so don't be concerned too much about that big gap. I'll just show you the numbers. So again, we're looking at the bottom of these troughs, if you like. That's where I go full throttle all the way to RPM, red line. So if you take this data point, it's 4.1 degrees in the tube with an ambient of 2.5 degrees, so 2.2 degrees. So we're almost 2 degrees delta between the tube and ambient. So clearly we can see a difference between the two variations. The duct with just a single sealed inlet to the airbox and one feed from the front is a lot better than having two feeds pulling in from the engine bay, which clearly shows that the air in the engine bay is warmer than ambient, despite having a secondary feed from the front. Right, that's the duct finalized. The next step is to look at the material to be used in the rear tube, metal versus plastic. Okay, so let's look at the data we collected to compare the plastic tube versus a metal tube for that rear section. So the way we measured or tested this was we took the car out, got it up to full temperature, and then we stopped the car in lay-by with the ignition off and just let the heat get to an equilibrium. So we let the temperature in the system come to a balance point where the air inside the tube wasn't going up anymore. So looking at the graphs in front of me, on the left I've got a graph which shows the temperature data for the metal tube, and on the right is the plastic tube. So let's start with the left one. So you can see here the temperature has stabilized within inside the tube at about 55 degrees, 56 degrees Celsius. In the plastic version, the temperature stabilized at just over 50 degrees Celsius. So straight away, the temperature difference is about 10% between the plastic and the metal tube in terms of the temperature of the air inside the tube once it's fully heat soaked. Okay, once the car was fully stabilized in terms of temperature, we took the car and went full throttle to see how quickly and how many pulls in third gear will it take for the temperature inside that tube to go down to as low as possible, so down to another equilibrium point. So you can see here, temperature drops rapidly as the car is switched on and driven. All these are full throttle episodes where we've gone third gear from 3000 RPM to red line. So we've gone, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So on the 7th pull, it's down to 14 degrees Celsius with an ambient of 12 and a half. So that's our equilibrium point there. So it's taken several runs to get down there. Let's compare that with the plastic version. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4. So on the 4th run, it's gone down to 14 degrees Celsius, which is much quicker than with the metal tube, because obviously we had a lower starting point in the first place, which pretty much is an easy decision for us to make. Metal tube, probably easy to make, but the plastic tube performs better in terms of temperature. So let's go with the plastic tube. So as you've seen on the road now, the stock airbox in the Yaris has a secondary flap which opens up at 4000 RPM. So it starts to pull in warmer air from the engine bay, which is very interesting when we look at the data. So on my screen I've got the temperature graph again, and this is the stock airbox, showing the temperature within that tube, in the rear tube, versus the ambient again. So we're going to look at these three sets of data points here. Now let me just explain what these are. At this point in the graph is where we go full throttle at, I think it was 3000 RPM, and then that continues, the temperature starts to drop, and at this point right here is when that secondary flap opens. So this is 4000 RPM. Now you can see the temperature starts to spike, and this is because the airbox is pulling in warmer air from the engine bay area. So you've gone from a temperature within that rear tube of 20 degrees, just under 20 degrees, and it spikes up all the way to 28 degrees Celsius. At the peak of that graph is where we then come off the RPM. This continues, so from there is we're coasting all the way to there, and at this point we floor it again. That's 4000 RPM, flap opens, temperature goes up all the way to red line, and again we did it for the third time and fourth time. So you can see a pattern here of data, very interesting. Flap opens and warm air goes into the airbox, which has an effect on obviously the rest of the temperature in the intake system, and it spikes to 28 degrees there. We've got 27 degrees and 26.5 degrees Celsius with an ambient of around 13 degrees Celsius. So that's a pretty big delta T for the stock airbox of 28 or 27 degrees minus 13 degrees. So we're at about 13 to 14 degrees delta C in the stock airbox system. Very interesting. Clearly shows that there's warm air in the engine bay, which is being pulled into the airbox when the flap opens at 4000 RPM. We're now going to show you what effect that has on the temperature before the intercooler, and then ultimately, very importantly, after the intercooler, which then goes into the actual engine. We've finalized the configuration of the Eventuri intake, and we've shown you the delta T, so the temperature difference between the air inside that rear tube versus ambient of the stock airbox, which was around 14 degrees Celsius, and with the Eventuri, it was within 1 degree Celsius. So that's a big improvement just in terms of the intake air going through the intake before the turbo. Now, of course, it's turbocharged, so that air is going to get heated as it goes through the turbo, and then that air will go through an intercooler, in which it will get cooled down. Now, in our experience with making intakes for turbocharged cars, a common misconception that people have is that they think it doesn't matter what the temperature of the air is going through an intake because it's going to get cooled down by an intercooler anyway. However, an intercooler does not cool down air to an absolute value. Intercoolers work on an efficiency ratio, if you like. So it depends on the ambient temperature, it depends on the air going into the intercooler, and then the structure of the intercooler and its performance and so on. But whatever you put into the intercooler on one side, that has an effect on what comes out on the other side. So you can't put lava in one side and get ice from the other side. The temperature of the air going into the intercooler is very important, and it affects what comes out of the intercooler. So the lower we can get the air going through the intake for the turbo and into the intercooler, the lower we should expect the air to come out of the intercooler. So a sealed intake with a low IAT is very important. Now, we're going to prove that to you now with the data we've collected. So in the next set of results we're going to show you, we have logged temperature again in that rear tube after the intake, in the tube before the intercooler, so the temperature of the air as it comes out of the turbo when it heats up. We've also logged the temperature on the other side of the intercooler, so that you can get a full picture of what's going on between the stock airbox and the Eventuri intake. Okay, now that my rant about intercoolers is over, we can take a look at the data we've collected. Right, there's a lot of data on my screen now. Let me start by just quickly explaining what the different colors mean. So let's start at the bottom. The light blue line is ambient temperature. The green line is the temperature after the intercooler. The dark blue line is the temperature after the filter, so in that rear tube section. The brown line is the temperature within the engine bay. And finally, that red line is the temperature after the turbo. Okay, on the left is the data for the stock airbox, and on the right is the data for the Eventuri intake. Let's start with the stock airbox system. So you've already seen how the flap opens up at 4,000 RPM and the temperature starts to rise in the tube. So let's look at the blue line to start with, because that's where the air is going to see first. So we're taking a journey with the air as it goes through the system. So it goes through the filter and then it gets measured in that rear tube, which is the blue line. So we are looking at this region right there before it starts to drop down. So that's where we go full throttle. Temperature drops slightly and then the flap opens in the airbox, temperature rises, and that's red line in that point. So this is our region of interest. Okay, what's happening in the turbo now? Air is going to the turbo, it's getting heated. So on full throttle, we start at 66 degrees. Air gets heated up to 128 degrees there, and on the next peak is 130 degrees. So we're going to about almost 130 degrees in the turbo. And then obviously as we let off, it comes back down again. But we're concerned with the peak temperature there, which is at the red line, full throttle, full RPM. That's what the air is getting up to in temperature. Okay, now that it's come through the turbo, it goes through the intercooler and the intercooler cools it down. So we're starting at 130 degrees. And now let's look at that green line. So you can see at the start of the run, which is there, the temperature after the intercooler is 15 degrees. I just mentioned ambient quickly is 12 degrees. So we're very close to ambient, which is as you'd expect before going full throttle. We go full throttle, air goes through the turbo, it's getting superheated, and the intercooler starts to work. Obviously the temperature is going to rise in the intercooler. So at the peak RPM, we've got a temperature in the intercooler at its peak of 31 degrees in that run. And the first one was 31.7, second was 31.7 again, and the third peak temperature was 32 degrees in the intercooler. Okay, so with that in mind, let's have a look at what happens with the Eventuri intake. Straight away you can see that the temperature in the turbo is lower on its peak than it was with the stock airbox. So let's start at the beginning again. The air goes through the intake first, so blue line, which is there, so it starts to drop. Now, as we've shown you before, we don't have a flap which opens up into the engine bay, so we're only pulling in cold air. So the temperature drops continuously all the way to red line, which is there. So temperature goes up in the turbo, and in this case, we've got 120 degrees as a peak turbo temperature, as opposed to 130 degrees with the stock airbox. Second run was 116 degrees, and the third run was again 116 degrees. Okay, now the most important data is after the intercooler, which is what the engine will see ultimately. So with the Eventuri, the temperature after the intercooler on the first run was 30 degrees, second run was 29 degrees, and the third run was 29 degrees as well, which is lower than how it was with the stock airbox. Finally, while we've still got this graphs in front of us, I'm going to quickly explain what that brown line is, which is the temperature in the engine bay. We put a probe near the flap of the stock airbox to show you the temperature of the air which is being pulled into the airbox when that flap opens. So when you're full throttle, after 4,000 RPM, that flap opens, and then as you can see on this graph on the left, that temperature starts to rise. Every time you floor it, it rises quite significantly. And the reason is because the airbox is pulling heated air in from around the engine bay area. So as the air comes into the airbox, it's passing the temperature probe, and it's registering that higher temperature which the airbox is pulling. So you've got temperatures going from around 27, 28 degrees, 24 degrees there, up to 37 degrees. So the airbox is pulling in a mixture of hot air from around the engine bay and also ambient air. On the Eventuri side, it's a lot more stable because we're only pulling in air from the front grille. That small rise you're seeing there is basically the stagnant engine bay air as it warms up when the turbo gets hot on the full throttle. There's no air rushing past that temperature probe because there's no flap opening as such. So we've been through the graphs and we're picking out the most important data points, which is the temperature after the intercooler, which is the temperature of the air which the engine will see ultimately. So having been through the intake, the turbo, the intercooler, we end up with air at this temperature. The graph here shows you the difference between the temperature after the intercooler and the ambient temperature. So it's how much hotter is the air after the intercooler as compared to the air outside. You can see very clearly that the Eventuri intake is consistently lower in that temperature after the intercooler compared to the stock airbox. Now, we did 6 runs, so we're showing you all 6 runs. They were done on the same day as well, with the same ambient. And the temperature difference between the Eventuri and the stock airbox, we're looking at between 2 to 3 degrees. Now, that may not sound like a huge difference on the face of it, but what you have to remember is this was done on a very cool English winter's day, which was around 11 degrees ambient. The hotter that temperature gets, so the hotter the ambient temperature, the higher these are going to go on almost a logarithmic scale. So it's more important to look at this as a percentage change. So I'm going to show you now the percentage differences. So we've taken all 6 runs and averaged them. So we've got the average of the stock airbox and the average of the Eventuri, and the average is the delta between that temperature which we just showed you and ambient. So now it's much more clear. The stock airbox has an average percentage rise in temperature of over 55%. The average rise in temperature through the Eventuri system, as it goes through the whole turbo and intercooler, is just under 36%. So you've got a difference of around 20% between the stock airbox and the Eventuri intake. So that 20% means that the Eventuri is performing, or is allowing the engine to see air temperature 20% lower in value compared to ambient than the stock airbox. So we've seen all the data regarding temperature. Temperature is very important. Obviously, the higher the temperature in the engine, in a lot of engines, the timing is reduced to compensate for that higher temperature to avoid knock. So temperature is very important. However, it's not the only thing when it comes to intake systems. With intakes, intake temperature is very important, but as important as that is flow. So how much flow rate is the intake capable of? How hard is the turbo working to reach its target boost? The more efficient an intake is, i.e. the more flow it can allow, the easier it is for a turbo to pull air in from that system and reach its peak boost. Let's think of an analogy. If you pull through a straw, think of how more difficult it will be if you had a thin straw as opposed to a very fat, big straw. So, I don't know, if you've got a McDonald's milkshake, which is quite thick, try and suck a McDonald's milkshake with a very, very thin straw. It'll be very difficult for you to do. So that's what a turbo is trying to do, is pulling air through a straw, if you like. So it's a tube, a filter, some sort of configuration. The more efficient that airbox system is, the easier it will be for the turbo to work. So now, to demonstrate that, we have tested our system and the stock system on a flow bench. Flow bench is used in industry typically for cylinder heads. We've also now used it for our airbox systems, and it shows you the maximum flow rate through the system at a given pressure drop. So we took the stock airbox and the Eventuri intake to get flow bench tested. The flow bench we were using is able to achieve a maximum pressure drop of 28 inches of H2O. Now, if we think of the flow bench doing the job of the turbo in this instance, it's pulling air through the system, and it will pull air up to its maximum flow rate capacity, and the lower the pressure drop, the less restrictive the system. So we tested the stock airbox with the airbox itself, the front duct, and also the rear tube. We did the same with the Eventuri, rear tube, the filter housing, and the front duct. It's very important to notice that, because had we tested just the Eventuri filter housing by itself, without that rear tube, versus just the stock airbox, the difference would have been much larger. But we've tested the system in its entirety to give you a better picture. Okay. On the screen in front of me, there's 3 data points. You've got the stock airbox with the flap closed, the stock airbox flap open, and then the Eventuri. As you can see, with the stock airbox closed flap, the flow bench is able to achieve its maximum 28 inches of H2O pressure drop. When you open that flap in the airbox, it's much less restrictive, so there's more flow being generated and able to go through the airbox, and therefore it dropped down to 16.5 inches of H2O. With the Eventuri, it's even better, and it was only able to hit a pressure drop of 13.5 inches of H2O. So put that into the context of a turbo. The turbo is seeing less restriction with the Eventuri versus the stock airbox, even with the flap open. So on these 3 data points, the maximum flow rate achieved in CFM was 377 for the stock airbox flap closed, 585 CFM stock airbox flap open, and 645 CFM with the Eventuri. So we've gone a long way now to prove that the Eventuri system is able to provide the engine with cooler air even after the intercooler, and also it's less restrictive, so the turbo is able to work more efficiently, so it can hit its peak boost sooner. Now, with all that data proved and shown to you, what does this actually mean in terms of performance with the car? So we took the car to RaceCal for an independent dyno test, and this is what happened. Okay, so the results are in. We've dynoed the car with the stock airbox and with the Venturi. Now, important to note that the car is completely standard. It has a stock exhaust system, ECU is untouched, everything is untouched apart from the intake. So, as you can see, it's a pretty decent result on the face of it. There's a change in performance throughout the whole RPM range. The Venturi is performing better than the stock airbox from all the way 2000, 2500, all the way to redline, which means that wherever you drive the car, your throttle response will be improved. The car will pull all the way to redline much more ferociously. It's not just a peak horsepower gain. This is very important because it shows you that the turbo is in fact spooling faster and it's hitting its peak boost quicker, which means the Venturi is more efficient and it's allowing the turbo to run with a lower wastegate duty cycle. Looking at the data itself, it's very impressive in terms of mid-range and low end. You've got 18 foot-pounds of torque increase across a large portion of that range, around 12 horsepower in the mid-range, which does continue up to the red line. Obviously, it is a lower increase right at the peak, but then we'd expect that because at the peak, you've got other restrictions coming into play, like the stock exhaust system, for example. With that OPF in there, is going to restrict the exhaust gases at that high RPM. So we'd expect with other supporting modifications like an exhaust, a free-flowing exhaust with a OPF delete, for example, if the waste gases are able to exit the system faster, the intake being more efficient will allow for a greater gain in the peak and obviously lower down as well. Another thing to notice is the ambient temperature between the two tests. The Dyno was pretty cold when we first went in. It was first tested with the stock airbox. Once that was done, obviously the car was warming up the temperature in the Dyno, and as you can see on the graph, the temperature in the cell with the stock airbox was 11.9 degrees Celsius. With the Venturi, it was 15.6 degrees Celsius. So we were actually at a disadvantage when testing the Venturi. Had we managed to get that Dyno down to the same temperature as the stock airbox, I'm confident we would have seen a greater gain. But even so, it's a very good result, showing clearly that all the data we've shown you with the temperature and the flow bench is coming into fruition in terms of giving you a gain on the dyno. So now that the dyno is done, what does this mean on the road? So we took the car out and we measured acceleration in gear between 100 to 200 kilometers per hour. And we found that with the Venturi, the acceleration was reduced by half a second from 100 to 200 kilometers per hour, which is a good result. Now, once the carbon system's ready, we will install that, we'll show you obviously, and we do expect the carbon system to work and perform better than the prototype plastic system that we've just shown you. Once we do that, we will do extensive draggy testing. We'll obviously record all that and disclose all that information in the next video. We've now come to the end of this video. I appreciate there's been a lot of data that we've discussed. It's been a very long video, but we felt it was very important to show you the detail in which we go to when developing and analyzing our intake systems. We wanted to show you what we're doing and how effective our designs are in terms of temperature, flow, and performance. There's not that much value in us just putting together an intake, taking it to a dyno and showing you a graph. We wanted to give you the background to why it's performing the way it's performing. And I hope you can appreciate the lengths we've gone to prove to you that our design is well researched and does work. We appreciate you hanging on for so long. Thank you very much, and hopefully you'll come back for the next round where we'll be showing the final system in carbon with full draggy testing.
Thank you so much for watching, guys. If you liked the video, please remember to smash that like button, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel. If you want to join the conversation, please drop a comment below and we'll try our best to respond to you. If If you want to watch more of this project, you can do so over here. If you want to watch what YouTube thinks you might like from our other content, you can do so over here.